How did the Battle of Blanchetaque in 1346, the campaign that forced France to defend its northern coast, navigate a lethal tidal trap? The English army, ragged and starving after weeks of raiding Normandy, finds itself pinned against the deep waters of the Somme estuary near Seigneville. King Edward III knows that King Philip VI is only miles away with an overwhelming host of heavy cavalry and Genoese mercenaries. If the English cannot find a path across the tidal marshes before the French arrive, the Plantagenet claim to the French throne dies in the Picardy mud. What did the English scouts find as the sun rose over the white chalk cliffs and the Picardy salt marshes? They find the River Somme, swollen and impassable, a wide barrier of grey water that mocks their desperate need for a northern escape. For hours, the weary soldiers sit in silence, listening to the distant rumble of the approaching French vanguard and the soft lapping of the rising tide. The king offers gold and freedom to any prisoner who knows a secret way through the shifting silt. A single captive, Gobin Agace, points a trembling finger toward the marshes of the White Ford. How would the English army rouse itself for a final, desperate gamble against the closing French trap? At 5 in the morning, the camp comes alive with the sound of snapping canvas and the jangling of armor as men prepare for the impossible. They march toward the bank, watching with trepidation as the water level remains high and the northern shore looms distant and dangerous. Across the channel, a blocking force of 3,500 Frenchmen waits under the command of Godemar du Fay. The long wait for the receding tide becomes a test of nerves as English morale begins to flicker. Why did the French commander Godemar du Fay feel confident in his defense of the Somme line? He holds the high bank with 500 elite men-at-arms and thousands of infantry, believing the tidal window is far too narrow for a massive crossing. From his position, he watches the English vanguard assemble, 12 abreast, on the narrow causeway that will soon emerge from the receding waves. He expects the English to flounder in the deep mud, making them easy targets for the bolts of his mercenary crossbowmen. That overconfidence leads him to keep his cavalry tightly packed at the water's edge. What happened when the clock struck 9 and the tide finally ebbed enough to reveal the white stones? The first ranks of English longbowmen, led by Hugh, Baron Despenser, plunge into the cold, waist-deep water of the Somme. They move slowly, their heavy yew-bows held high to keep the strings dry, as the French crossbowmen begin to unleash their first volleys. The salt spray and the morning mist cloud their vision, but the archers maintain a steady, disciplined pace toward the center of the river. This initial movement turns the riverbed into a corridor of impending violence. How did the longbowmen respond to the incoming storm of crossbow bolts from the northern bank? They halt in the middle of the river, standing in the churning current to return fire with terrifying speed and precision. The superior rate of fire of the longbow, unleashing 10 arrows for every 3 bolts, quickly suppresses the Genoese mercenaries on the far bank. The French defenders are shocked by the dark cloud of arrows that seems to fall from the sky with the force of a physical weight. That relentless pressure forces the French infantry to crouch behind their shields and lose their aim. Why did the French cavalry decide to abandon the safety of the high bank at the decisive moment? Sensing the infantry lines wavering, Godemar du Fay orders his 500 mounted knights to splash into the river and meet the English in the water. This is the mechanism of his defeat, as he gives up the terrain advantage to engage in a vicious scrum where the footing is treacherous. The knights believe a charge will shatter the archers, but they find only a wall of steel and falling arrows. That aggressive move turns the middle of the river into a slaughterhouse. Where did the two bodies of cavalry meet in the center of the ford during the peak of the ebb? English men-at-arms, led by the Earl of Northampton and Reginald Cobham, clash with the French knights in the salt ebb of the receding tide. Horses slip on the white chalk stones and panic in the swirling current as the sound of steel on armor rings across the estuary. It is a miserable, horrible melee where men in waterlogged gear hack at each other from the backs of struggling beasts. That stalemate in the water buys the English archers time to fan out. How did the English archers use the newly exposed land to their advantage as the water level dropped? As the tide drops further, the Longbowmen reach the muddy shallows and spread out in a broad wedge to enfilade the French lines. They pour thick, controlled volleys into the gaps of the French armor, targeting the horses to create chaos in the enemy ranks. The French knights find themselves trapped between the charging English vanguard and the relentless rain of arrows from the flanks. That coordinated fire breaks the cohesion of the French center and turns the charge into a tangle. What caused the French resolve to finally snap under the pressure of the English combined arms? The sky darkens with a second massive volley of bodkin-tipped arrows that pierces even the heavy plate of the elite men-at-arms. Seeing their noble leaders fall and their infantry decimated, the French common soldiers turn and flee toward the gates of Abbeville. The retreat of the foot soldiers pulls the cavalry back into a disorganized mass of panicking men and horses. That collapse of the line turns a defensive stand into a chaotic route that leaves the northern bank open. Why was the timing of the English breakout considered a miracle of the tide by the chroniclers? Within 90 minutes of the first arrow being loosed, the entire English vanguard reaches the dry ground of the northern shore. They do not stop to rest, but immediately give chase to the fleeing French, slaughtering thousands in the 3-mile pursuit toward the safety of the city walls. Behind them, the massive English baggage train and the rest of the army begin to pour across the now dry ford. That rapid movement ensures the crossing is completed before the tide can return. Where was King Philip VI as his carefully prepared trap was being dismantled at the ford? The main French army arrives at the southern bank just as the last of the English rearguard steps onto the white stones of the causeway. Philip watches in fury as his quarry disappears into the distance, but the River Somme is already beginning to swell once more. The tide is rushing back in with the force of the sea, making the ford impassable for his heavy cavalry. That returning water strands the French king on the wrong side of the river. How did the English army feel as they looked back across the rising water at their pursuers? The troops are exhausted and ragged, but the sense of relief is palpable as they realize they have escaped the Vimy bottleneck. They watch the French scouts on the distant shore, knowing they have gained a 2-day head start that will determine the fate of the campaign. The miracle of Blanchetaque has transformed a starving band of fugitives back into a potent and confident fighting force. That psychological shift is the most valuable prize of the morning's victory. What did the English find in the captured coastal towns of Noyelles and Le Crotoy? Unlike the scorched earth they left behind, this region of Picardy is rich with supplies and undefended stores of food. They seize several Poitou ships filled with wine and bread, allowing the soldiers to finally feast and recover their strength after weeks of near starvation. The capture of these towns provides the logistical salvation the army desperately required to face the coming storm. That resupply turns a desperate escape into a strategic preparation for a decisive battle. How did Edward III use the respite granted by the crossing to prepare for the final encounter? He spends the next 48 hours scouting the terrain and selecting a defensive position on the ridgeline of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. He knows that Philip will be forced to take a long detour through Abbeville, giving the English time to dig pits and sharpen stakes. The king personally oversees the placement of his divisions, ensuring his archers have the highest ground and the clearest lines of sight. That meticulous planning is made possible only by the success at the White Ford. Why did the longbow prove so decisive in the shifting waters of the Somme estuary? The mechanism of victory was the technical superiority of the English archer, who could maintain accuracy and power even while standing waist-deep in a tidal current. While the French crossbow was a lethal tool, its slow reload time and sensitivity to the damp environment made it a liability in the salt spray. The English archers had spent their lives training for this moment, building the immense strength required to draw their bows. That lifelong discipline manifested as a dark cloud of death. What were the concrete consequences of Godemar du Fay's leadership failure during the beachhead defense? By charging into the river to meet the English knights, he abandoned the natural protection of the high bank and allowed his infantry to be suppressed. His tactical impatience reflected a French military culture that prioritized chivalric aggression over the cold logic of defense. This error resulted in the loss of 2,000 men and the capture of 25 noble banners, shattering the morale of the local garrisons. That failure signaled to King Philip that the English were not yet defeated. How did the Black Prince experience his first major tactical maneuver at the crossing of Blanchetaque? Though only 16, he rode in the vanguard alongside veterans of the Scottish Wars, witnessing the lethal efficiency of combined arms coordination. He learned that a smaller, disciplined force could overcome a larger enemy through the clever use of terrain and timing. This experience in the waterlogged melee of the Somme would serve as the final preparation for his legendary stand at the Battle of Crécy. That exposure to high-stakes command forged the prince into a future master of the battlefield. What does the story of the White Ford tell us about the nature of warfare in 1346? It was a year where administrative rigor and innovative technology collided with traditional feudalism and tidal mechanics. The victory at Blanchetaque was not a stroke of luck, but the result of an intelligence network that found the only gate through an impassable wall. Without those white stones, the 100 Years' War might have ended as a minor footnote in the history of failed rebellions. That narrow crossing changed the destiny of two kingdoms and reshaped European warfare forever. How did the medieval world react to the news of the miraculous English escape across the Somme? Chroniclers across Europe began to speak of divine favor and the incredible power of the Longbowmen who could fight from the very sea itself. This victory set the stage for the fall of the French chivalry and the rise of England as a dominant military power on the continent. The broader implications of the Siege of Calais, the founding of the Order of the Garter, and the long-term economic shifts following the Black Death will be the subject of another episode. Which next episode should we explore? From the Longbow's reign to the ebbing tides of the Somme, the path to victory was paved by the white stones of Blanchetaque. Scan the QR code on screen to subscribe and continue the series.